The official narrative tells a story of horror within the walls of 1122 King Road. A single intruder enters during the early morning hours. 4 students are murdered. 2 on the 3rd floor, 2 on the 2nd. The killer slips away. No one else in the house is harmed. No alarm is raised for 8 hours. But in the earliest days of the case, this version of events left some people unsettled. Online speculation began almost immediately after the scene was described. Commenters questioned the presence and location of blood. Why did some early photos show what appeared to be blood leaking from the foundation of the house? Was there enough blood described in official reports to match the violence of 4 stabbings? Could the scene have been altered or arranged? From these questions emerged a darker idea, that the victims may not have been killed in that house at all, that the crime scene may have been altered and the bodies were moved or positioned, that blood was transferred and evidence manipulated. It's a theory that challenges the very foundation of the official investigation. It implies not only deception, but a level of control and premeditation that would make this crime something else entirely. If the killings didn't happen inside that house, everything changes. The timeline becomes wider. The suspect's movements must be reinterpreted. Forensic conclusions are thrown into question. And the very nature of the crime, its planning, its motive, its execution, takes on a new and more calculated shape. It might sound extreme, but in this series we don't dismiss theories because they're uncomfortable. We examine whether they're possible, and whether the facts can bear their weight. In this part of our investigation, we'll break down the scene itself. What forensic evidence was found inside the home? Could that evidence have been planted, manipulated, or misinterpreted? Is it logistically possible for 4 people to have been killed elsewhere and placed back inside their own home undetected? We'll also look at autopsy data, body positioning, historical precedent, and the quiet spaces in the timeline, the hours where almost anything could have happened, and no one knew. As always, this is not an accusation, it's not a conspiracy, it's a question. Were the victims killed inside 1122 King Road, or did the real horror happen somewhere else entirely? If we're to challenge the assumption that the victims were killed inside 1122 King Road, we must start with the known crime scene, not what was speculated online or what was suggested in comment threads, but what the forensic evidence actually confirmed. Publicly available documents, along with eyewitness accounts from first responders, confirmed that the scene was one of extreme violence, and all 4 victims suffered multiple stab wounds. Blood was present inside the bedrooms, on bedding, and in at least one case, reportedly visible on the exterior foundation of the house, beneath a wall where Madison and Kaylee were found. The exterior blood, seen trailing downward, was cited as early evidence that the attacks were particularly brutal. Critics of the killed elsewhere theory pointed to this as proof. The volume and direction of blood flow suggest that the wounds were inflicted on site, and that the victims bled extensively where they were found. Madison and Kaylee were found in the same bed on the 3rd floor. Ethan and Xana were discovered in Xana's 2nd floor bedroom. Both floors showed signs consistent with an attack occurring in place. There was blood pooling beneath or near the bodies, but no evidence that the victims had been dragged. There weren't any signs of post-mortem body staging, according to early investigative statements. The bodies appeared to be in defensive or resting positions. There was no mention of rigor mortis being disrupted, which can happen if bodies are moved after death. Autopsy reports, though not fully released to the public, suggest that at least 2 of the victims, Ethan and Xana, showed signs of fighting back. Xana in particular had defensive wounds. Items in her own room may have been disturbed, consistent with a struggle. These details point toward an attack that was active and chaotic, not a post-mortem placement. And importantly, the house itself bore marks of violence. Blood evidence, possible splatter, and transfer patterns on interior walls and bedding, not just pools, but dynamic bloodstains. Crime scene cleanup crews who later entered the house described the interior as deeply contaminated, not with a small amount of staged material, but with extensive biological evidence. There was nothing to suggest that the home was simply a dumping ground. It was, in every forensic sense, a crime scene. It's worth stating clearly that we don't have access to the full crime scene report. Only selected court filings and media accounts offer glimpses. But within those glimpses, one truth seems clear. There is no strong forensic basis to believe that the victims were killed elsewhere and brought back. If that happened, the staging would have required surgical precision. No blood trail was left outside, and there weren't any errors in body placement. There wasn't any disturbed rigor and no forensic mismatches. One of the most critical and least discussed pieces of this case is the 911 call made by the surviving roommates at 11:56 a.m. According to court records, the call described someone as unconscious, no mention of injuries, no reference of blood, no sign that what lay inside that house was one of the most brutal multiple homicides in recent memory. That absence of detail, of urgency, of language that reflects the reality of the scene has triggered an entirely separate theory. What if the victims didn't die inside the house? Some believe the call reflects trauma and confusion. Others argue it suggests something more calculated, that the scene, or at least parts of it, had been deliberately cleaned, altered, or staged to mask the truth. And if the caller didn't see blood, if the scene appeared strangely peaceful from the outside, what exactly were they looking at? The theory that the victims were killed elsewhere is not impossible, but based on what we know, what has been confirmed through crime scene photos, affidavits, and official statements, it is unlikely. The house doesn't just hold the bodies, it holds the evidence of violence itself, and until that evidence is disproven, the presumption must remain that 1122 King Road was not just where they were found, it was where they died. To entertain the possibility that the murders took place somewhere other than 1122 King Road, we must confront a much more difficult question. Could it actually be done? We're not talking about moving a single body. This theory requires relocating 4 individuals, 2 from the 3rd floor, 2 from the 2nd. Each victim was of adult size, and each reportedly found in or near a bed, in what appeared to be a natural state of rest or defense. If they were killed elsewhere, the perpetrator would have needed to kill 4 people in a separate, undisclosed location, clean or contain any blood evidence from that scene. They would need to transport the bodies undetected and re-enter 1122 King Road without drawing attention to place each victim in a realistic position, then leave behind a convincing amount of blood at the new scene without forensic error. Let's examine the transport itself. Even with a large vehicle, such as a van or SUV, moving 4 deceased individuals poses significant risks. The weight and bulk make movement physically demanding. Along with this, the time becomes a critical factor, especially between 4 a.m. and dawn. There would likely be blood leakage unless the victims were contained in plastic or wrapped securely. Any trace left in the vehicle, fluids, fibers, DNA, would become potential evidence. Additionally, the suspect would have to avoid security cameras, traffic stops, and potential sightings. There is no known footage, data, or testimony that suggests the presence of such a vehicle during that window. The staging theory requires that after killing the victims elsewhere, the killer, or killers, re-entered the home and placed each body in its designated room. This means accessing 2 floors quietly, in the dark, carrying dead weight, and arranging each body in a convincing way without disturbing the surrounding scene. There would also need to be secondary staging. Blood would have to be applied or allowed to seep naturally, and objects would have to be placed to avoid suspicion. The killer would have to avoid leaving their own forensic trail in the process. No windows were broken, no blood was found outside, no witnesses reported anyone carrying anything into the home. No neighbours reported suspicious vehicle movement or unusual noise in the hours after the estimated time of death. In short, nothing about the crime scene, neighbourhood, or timeline supports the idea that the bodies were carried into the house after the death. If the murders occurred between 4 and 4:25 a.m., and the Elantra was seen leaving the area around 4:20 a.m., then any alternative timeline involving external movement would need to fit within an incredibly narrow window, or take place earlier in the night, which would risk detection. There's also the question of Dylan Mortenson's report. She heard crying. She saw a masked man. Was this staged or part of a real-time attack? If the cries were genuine, and if they occurred during or after 4 a.m., that would strongly support the theory that the murders happened inside the house, not elsewhere. The logistics required to kill 4 people elsewhere, clean up the original scene, transport the bodies, stage them convincingly, and leave no trace, are not just complex, they are almost implausible. Without a second vehicle, a secondary scene, or a break in the timeline, this theory collapses under its own weight. That doesn't mean it's impossible. But in cases like this, plausibility matters, and the burden of that possibility is heavy. For any theory to gain traction against the weight of official evidence, it must find leverage. Not just a contradiction, but a crack, a red flag, an inconsistency, a detail that doesn't belong. And in this chapter we ask, did the crime scene show signs of being staged or manipulated? The first and most often cited detail is the knife sheath. A military-style K-bar sheath was found near Madison Mogen's body, lying flat, with the snap button open and a single trace DNA. Critics have asked, was it dropped accidentally, or was it planted deliberately? It was the only physical object directly linking Bryan Kohberger to the scene. There was no DNA from him on the victims, the bedding, the walls, or the floors, only the sheath. Its placement, next to the bodies, in a location where it would surely be found, has raised questions. Would a meticulous killer leave behind such a damning item? Photos from the scene have not been released publicly in full, but statements from responders and investigators describe substantial blood presence on bedding, floors, and walls. One particularly disturbing detail reported early on was blood visibly leaking from the third-floor bedroom onto the exterior of the home. This suggests a high-volume bleed, consistent with death occurring in place. However, what we don't have are clear reports on blood transfer patterns between rooms. We don't have cast-off spatter from the weapon, disturbed footprints or drag marks. If the bodies were moved post-mortem, even within the house, we might expect inconsistencies in how blood settled or pooled. Victims were reportedly found in positions that aligned with sleep or defense. There's no mention of bodies being posed, folded unnaturally, or placed in ways that contradicted gravity or rigor mortis. Staging a body convincingly is extremely difficult, especially when done in darkness, in a confined space, under time pressure. There have been no public claims of body placement that seemed off to investigators. Supporters of this theory often point not to what is found, but what wasn't. No blood trail leading out of the house, no murder weapon, no conclusive signs of forced entry, no surveillance footage capturing the crime itself. But these gaps do not confirm staging. They may simply reflect the precision of the attack, or the limits of what has been made public. Most of what we know has come through filtered sources, media summaries, court filings, and affidavits shaped by prosecutorial framing. No full crime scene photos, no full autopsy reports, no unredacted investigative notes. Until those are made public, any theory, including staging, will live in the grey space between certainty and speculation. If the scene was staged, it was staged perfectly. The blood, the bodies, the positioning, all supports a narrative of death in place. And while the sheath raises suspicion, so far, nothing in the forensic record proves it doesn't belong. In the absence of red flags, we are left with one haunting possibility. Either the crime happened exactly as described, or someone knew exactly how to make it look that way. When questions arise about where a person died, the autopsy becomes a final witness. It speaks to the violence done, it marks the moment life ended, and it can sometimes reveal if a body was moved or if the death happened precisely where the victim was found. While full autopsy reports have not been released to the public, partial summaries have been referenced in court documents and media reports. What we do know is that all 4 victims died from multiple stab wounds. The wounds were inflicted with significant force using a large, fixed-blade weapon. Some victims had defensive wounds, particularly Zanika Nodal, who reportedly had bruising and cuts consistent with fighting back. Ethan Chapin also sustained sharp force trauma and may have been alert at the time of the attack. In cases of stabbing, blood loss is typically the cause of death, especially when arteries or organs are pierced. In this case, blood reportedly pooled beneath and around the victims. It was also found soaking into the bedding and floorboards. One account described blood leaking from the third-floor bedroom down the side of the house. These patterns suggest the crime occurred in place, not elsewhere, not earlier, and not in transit. No autopsy report has stated that rigor mortis had been disrupted, a key clue when assessing if a body had been repositioned post-mortem. Rigor mortis typically sets in within 2 to 6 hours after death and can be disturbed if a body is moved unnaturally after that point. According to police and coroner statements, all victims were found in natural defensive positions. Madison and Katie were found in bed side by side. Ethan was found near or just outside Xana's room, and Xana was found in or near her bed. There were no reported signs of confrontation, slumping, or placement inconsistent with expected body behavior after death. Investigators believe the murders occurred between approximately 4 and 4:25 a.m. This is supported by digital evidence such as phone activity, Dylan Mortensen's reported observations, and surveillance footage of a vehicle arriving and leaving. There is no official autopsy detail that contradicts this timeline, no evidence that suggests the bodies were already deceased before this window. So could the bodies have been moved after death? Theoretically, yes, but the autopsy details don't support it. If the bodies were relocated, we would expect secondary blood pooling inconsistent with the position found. We'd expect disturbed rigor, forensic substances or fibers, signs of dragging or compression injuries. Yet, no such findings have been disclosed in any official statement or filing. Everything known to this point supports one conclusion, that the victims died where they were found. Autopsies don't lie, they record trauma, they trace time, and they can quietly disprove theories that seem plausible from a distance. In this case, nothing in the medical filing supports the idea that the victims were killed elsewhere. On the contrary, every cut, every bruise, every drop of blood points back to that house, to those rooms, and to the final moments that happened there. So it raises the question, why didn't they notice or see the blood or mention it during the 911 call? In the digital age, nearly everything leaves a trail. Where we go, what we see, who we call, and when we stop moving. For investigators, these traces become timelines, and when examining a theory as complex as this one, that the victims may have been killed elsewhere, those digital footprints become critical. Very little has been made public regarding the victims' phone data, but what we do know helps frame a clear outline of the night's events. Kaylee Gonsalves reportedly made multiple calls between 2:26 a.m. and 2:52 a.m. She called her ex-boyfriend Jack repeatedly. Both she and Madison made attempts. These calls were traced from within the house, placing them firmly inside 1122 King Road. No victim's phone appeared to leave the home after that point. This supports the belief that all 4 victims were in the house, alive, less than 90 minutes before the attack. There were no emergency messages, no signs of distress, no cryptic posts or last-minute signals from any of the victims. Their activity, where documented, appears normal. Had the victims been lured out, abducted, or moved, we might expect interruptions in digital behavior, location shifts, dropped connections, pings from towers outside the known area, but none of that has been reported. Location data can be extracted from phones in several ways, via GPS, Wi-Fi triangulation, and cell phone tower pings. Although not all devices provide precise GPS data, cell tower triangulation can place a user within hundreds of feet of a location. According to investigators, the victims' phones never left the vicinity of the house after they returned from their night out. Their last known pings and calls made all align with the timeline of them being home, in their rooms, preparing for bed. Had any of the victims left the home, even briefly, we would expect surveillance footage from nearby roads, gaps in Wi-Fi or cellular connectivity, or alerts triggered by tracking apps like Find My iPhone or Life 360. None of these have been mentioned in any official documents or reported by family members. This silence speaks volumes. Police found the victims' phones at the scene. There had been no public suggestion that their devices were wiped, destroyed, or manipulated. A killer seeking to obscure relocation would have to handle each device with surgical care, ensuring timelines remained intact, activity continued post-mortem, and no traces of involvement were left behind. So far, nothing suggests that level of tampering occurred. In a world of constant connection, disappearance is difficult, and manipulation, especially digital, leaves fingerprints. All known phone activity points to the same conclusion reached by forensic evidence. The victims were at 1122 King Road. They didn't leave, they weren't moved, and whatever happened that night, it happened there. Of all the physical evidence found at the scene of the Idaho 4 murders, none carries more weight or more mystery than the K-bar knife sheath. A single object lying beside one of the victims, a single source of DNA, and a singular question. Was it a careless mistake or something more deliberate? The sheath was discovered on the bed next to Madison Mogen. It was found with the snap unbuttoned, the top flap open, and the weapon missing. Its positioning beside the victim's body immediately drew attention. It wasn't buried beneath clutter or hidden under bedding. It was in plain sight. Investigators recovered a single source male DNA profile from the snap button of the sheath. That DNA led to Bryan Kohberger, first through genealogical tracing, then through a direct match after his arrest. It remains the only physical evidence that places Kohberger inside the home. Some have asked whether the sheath could have been placed intentionally to frame Kohberger. The theory suggests that someone with access to his DNA, perhaps from shared spaces or discarded items, planted the sheath to redirect suspicion. But this theory faces significant challenges. The DNA was reportedly found in a location consistent with regular use, the snap, not the outside surface. To plant it convincingly, someone would have needed to possess the sheath, place it precisely at the scene, and ensure only Kohberger's DNA was present, all without introducing their own. This level of forensic manipulation is extremely difficult to execute. If Kohberger is guilty, the sheath may represent a moment of oversight, dropped during the chaos, unnoticed in a room filled with panic. Or perhaps, if the crime was committed with planning and control, the presence of the sheath feels inconsistent, a blunder in an otherwise surgical execution. But if someone else was responsible, its presence becomes even more curious. Why leave behind only one trace? Why ensure that trace carries DNA, and that it leads back to a specific person? This is where the sheath becomes pivotal. If the victims were killed elsewhere, the sheath would have needed to be placed beside the body post-mortem, either to create a false link or as part of a staging process. But forensic reports indicate the sheath was recovered amid pooled blood, suggesting it was present during the attack, not after. There's no indication that the sheath was bloodless, and its location suggests real-time presence. The sheath holds no visible fingerprints, no secondary DNA, no physical evidence linking it to anyone else. And yet, in a house where no other forensic trace of Kohberger has been found, this single object remains, like a breadcrumb left for investigators to follow. Was it a trap? Was it arrogance? Or was it the only thing the killer didn't realize they'd dropped? In a case defined by shadows and silence, the sheath is the loudest clue. It tells a story, one of presence, one of proximity, and perhaps one of miscalculation. Whether dropped in chaos or placed with intent, it remains the clearest thread between the suspect and the scene, and for the theory that the victims were killed elsewhere, this object alone may unravel everything. On November the 13th, 2022, two people inside 1122 King Road survived, Bethany Funk and Dylan Mortensen. Neither were physically harmed, but one of them, Dylan, saw and heard something that would become a focal point of the investigation. And in this chapter we'll revisit her account, not to challenge her character, but to ask whether her experience helps confirm the killings happened inside the house, or whether it leaves more questions than answers. According to the arrest affidavit, Dylan Mortensen awoke at approximately 4 a.m. to what she described as noises coming from upstairs, including crying, and a voice saying something like, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." She reportedly opened her bedroom door multiple times throughout the night, not just once, indicating a progressive awareness that something wasn't right. The most chilling moment came when Dylan says she opened the door and saw a man walking past her. He was dressed in black, wore a mask covering his mouth and nose, and had bushy eyebrows. He walked toward the sliding glass door and exited. She described being frozen in shock and immediately returned to her bed. If you watched our last video when we covered her account, it is reported that Dylan later left her room and went to Bethany Funk's on the first floor. This evidence suggests that both survivors remained inside the house for hours afterwards, with Dylan reportedly awake and using social media, including messaging and browsing, well into the morning. This detail has drawn scrutiny. Why wasn't 911 called immediately? Why did activity continue online while 4 of her housemates lay dead upstairs? One possible explanation is trauma, freezing, shock. Not disbelief, but disassociation, a common response to overwhelming fear. So could her account support the in-house killing theory? Yes, and significantly. Her descriptions match a timeline of the attack occurring around 4 a.m., with real-time auditory clues. Crying, speech, and visible movement through the home. Those details suggest that the murders were happening inside the house, not elsewhere. If the victims had been killed outside the home and later placed inside, what did Dylan hear? Who was crying? Whose voice offered comfort? And who or what walked past her in black? Court reports suggest that Dylan used her phone to message friends and scroll through social media in the hours after the encounter. This has never been denied publicly. This indicates she remained awake, alert, and unsure of what she had witnessed, possibly believing the disturbance was drunken behavior or a misunderstanding. Again, this does not confirm guilt, nor does it cast suspicion, but it raises important context. Her actions suggest she was not immediately aware that a quadruple homicide had occurred. But how would she have been able to miss such significant amounts of blood? Could this have been shock, fear, or disassociation? Dylan Mortenson's account may be one of the strongest pieces of evidence against the theory that victims were killed elsewhere. Her timeline places the attack inside the house. Her words suggest real-time violence, and her sighting links an intruder, masked and moving, to the immediate aftermath. For this theory to hold, one would have to believe that what she saw and what she heard was staged or imagined, and that possibility, while not impossible, feels far more remote than the truth hiding in plain sight. Criminal history is filled with killers who try to hide what they've done, to shift blame, delay detection, or rewrite the scene. Some succeed, most fail, but in every case, staging leaves behind something unnatural, a detail that doesn't quite fit, a body out of place, a timeline that fractures under close inspection. Staging, by definition, is the deliberate manipulation of a crime scene to mislead investigators. It can take many forms, such as moving a body post-mortem, cleaning or planting blood, faking signs of a break-in, leaving misleading evidence, or destroying key forensic material. The intent is always the same, to control the story the evidence tells. Some famous cases of staging include the Jeremy MacDonald case in 1970. A former Green Beret doctor claimed that his family were murdered by intruders, but investigators found that he had attempted to stage the scene, inflicting wounds on himself, rearranging furniture, and using household items to fabricate a struggle. It took over a decade to convict him, but the inconsistencies eventually caught up. There was a case of Darlie Routier in 1996. Routier claimed that an intruder broke in and stabbed her 2 sons, but prosecutors argued she staged the scene, cutting a window screen, self-inflicting wounds, and manipulating blood evidence. The timeline didn't match, and the scene felt too clean. There was the case of Scott Peterson in 2002. Peterson killed his pregnant wife, Lacey, and dumped her body in the San Francisco Bay. He then staged a day of fishing and fabricated a timeline of normal behavior. Though the scene wasn't staged in the traditional sense, his behavior was a classic form of emotional staging, an attempt to build a false alibi. Across these cases and many others, staging has common traits. The scene feels unnatural. There's a gap between evidence and explanation. The killer often overcompensates, either by planting too much or too little. In nearly all cases, investigators eventually pick up on the flaws. So does the Idaho 4 case fit that pattern? So far, nothing publicly known about 1122 King Road suggests clear signs of staging. There were no forced entries faked, no bodies placed in unnatural positions, no suspicious cleaning products or blood patterns inconsistent with trauma, no forged notes, alibis, or cover stories. If there was staging, it was subtle, almost surgical. And in that lies the problem. Staging rarely works because it's rarely perfect. This crime scene, by contrast, appears raw, violent, and forensic in its detail. As we discussed earlier, the knife sheath remains one item that feels too perfect. It's the only physical link to a suspect, left behind amid an otherwise invisible trail. Could it have been planted? Possibly. But beyond that, the rest of the scene shows no classic signs of manipulation. In criminal history, staged scenes almost always leave footprints. But at 1122 King Road, what we find is not inconsistency, but overwhelming silence. And perhaps that's the final clue. When the killers stage a scene, they try to tell a different story. Here, the scene didn't tell a different story. It simply told one that was hard to believe. So could 4 people be murdered somewhere else other than 1122 King Road, carried back into their own home, staged convincingly in their bedrooms, and left there without a single slip? Every indicator we've examined, from the crime scene to the autopsies, from digital trails to body positioning, from survivor testimony to the very nature of the blood, points to one undeniable conclusion. The violence happened inside that house. To kill 4 people elsewhere, to take a separate location, undetected, a vehicle large enough to transport 4 bodies, a method of moving them without leaving trace evidence, a full return to 1122 King Road without being seen, blood applied or allowed to flow naturally at the scene, bodies placed with anatomical and forensic realism, and a perfect escape, all within a narrow window of time. Even professional hit teams don't typically operate with that level of flawless execution. What wasn't found was a second scene, no second vehicle, no witnesses, no drag marks, and no clean-up evidence. No evidence of any forensic mismatch between where the bodies were found and where they died. This theory, like others we will explore in this series, isn't born from fantasy. It's born from disbelief. Disbelief that one person could move so quickly. Disbelief that 4 people could have been murdered in silence. Disbelief that a scene so savage could yield so little. And in that disbelief, some look outward, searching for alternative places, alternate actors, and alternate answers. The blood was there, the cries were heard, the timeline holds, and the physical reality of death remains stitched into the floorboards of 1122 King Road. If this was a staging, then it was beyond professional, beyond rational, and beyond what the facts, so far, are willing to support. In the end, the silence of the house isn't proof of relocation. It's the echo of something even more chilling, that this may have been exactly what it appeared to be, and that the horror didn't happen elsewhere, it happened in their own home. This concludes part 3 of our investigative series, The Idaho 4, Theories Behind the Official Narrative. In this episode, we explored the possibilities that the victims were killed elsewhere and placed in the scene. The evidence doesn't support it, but the question is worth asking. In upcoming episodes, we'll continue to challenge assumptions, including whether a firearm may have been used, the role of the surviving roommates, public contradictions and interviews, and a full breakdown of the official court documents. If you found this episode insightful, we invite you to like, comment, and subscribe.